Hi, everyone. It's the Catholic CEO, Henry Katarna. My special guest today is Dr. Brian Carl. He's the director of the Center for Thomistic Studies, and he's an associate professor at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. And I've had the great privilege of meeting him in person, and here we are on a call today. So I'm very pleased that we're going to interview him. We'll get back to him in just a moment. Just wanted to mention that please check out the Catholic CEO's website. Check out our project, which is the Catholic Economy, www.thecatholiceconomy.com. And we have some interesting announcements coming up shortly about the St. Joseph Workshop and the Upper Room. So stay tuned for those. And so now, though, back to Brian Carl. So, Brian, it's really great to see you again. And how are you doing these days?
Oh, it's very good to see you too, Henry, and doing well. Just busy, especially this time of year with the academic semester about halfway through, and all the advising and things that are going on this time of year. But
Exactly.
things have been good.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I had the privilege of attending a colloquium at your facility at the university there during the summer, and so I was greatly pleased to be with you in person there and to see the operation and to see how it all goes. So, but as far as the program today goes, our audience is always interested in looking at Catholic leaders and sort of understanding how they operate, what their faith journey was all about, and where they've come from and what they're doing. So maybe I could start with you, Brian. What is your faith journey story? Could you summarize that for us? I think it would be very helpful.
Thank you. First, let me say, it's an honor to be asked to be, on something that's, for profiling Catholic leaders. I'm very junior as a Catholic leader. I've been in my, position as, director of the graduate program just for a couple of years now. So I'll be light on trying to give anyone else advice about how to run things. So I grew up Catholic. I grew up here in Houston, Texas. Went to Catholic grade school, went to Catholic high school. My family was always, practicing. I, went to, mass for Sundays and solemnities growing up. My mother is very devout, and in just a lot of little ways. She was a sort of witness and example for me as a kid. If something went wrong for me, she would encourage me to pray. And she was always, I knew that she was always praying whenever someone needed prayers. It was, something that she was always doing, and it had a big impact on me as a kid. I always believed in God and always had something of a prayer life as a kid. But one of the areas where maybe things weren't as strong for me growing up was, local Catholic grade school catechesis was not all that strong. And so, I had, I believed in God and I prayed, but I had a very kind of loose, wishy-washy sort of sense of what what Catholic faith actually holds or believes in any, in terms of any detail. And my high school was a little bit better, at least in terms of posing more serious questions, and at least getting me to think maybe there might be, some serious questions. But even then, it wasn't really strong catechetically. It was sort of, the beginnings of good theology, but I still didn't have the background just in terms of like a lot of basic catechesis. First half of high school, I was kind of this combination of, yes, I attended mass and I would sincerely pray, but in terms of how I thought about the world and thought about myself, I was kind of like a moral relativist, and my attachment to, the faith, it was kind of well, this is nice for me and it's not for everybody kind of view. And I think that was really common, for the other kids, from my grade school and high school. So I had a more serious conversion experience late in high school, just on a retreat over the summer. I had been, there were some good experiences on retreats when I was in grade school and high school, and was first exposed to Eucharistic adoration, and had a much deeper, sort of conversion experience late in high school. Started thinking seriously about the possibility of a priestly or religious vocation, and then started to realize I didn't actually know what the Catholic faith taught in very much detail. And so all this had a big impact on us. I was going into senior year of high school where I was thinking about going to college and what I was looking for. I ended up deciding I was only going to apply to Catholic colleges and universities, that I wanted to go somewhere that I could study philosophy. Initially that was, I just wanted that to be an option because I was thinking about the priesthood. So I first got into studying philosophy just because it was, something I would need to do if I was going to go to seminary and try to become a priest. And senior year of high school and then, beginnings of college, sort of made up, a lot of ground in terms of, just how well catechized I was, and had a really good group of friends early at college. I went to St. Louis University for my studies, and in the circle of friends there who were very good, there's a group that's still at St. Louis University called the Edmund Campion Society.
Yes.
And it's just this wonderful group for graduate and undergraduate students with serious, discussion of philosophy and theology, and lots of opportunities for prayer and for adoration, for mass. So in that group of friends that I got in touch with and got to know at St. Louis University, I met my future wife, and we started dating at the end of my sophomore year. And and by that point, I had encountered mentors for the study of philosophy, and one philosophy professor in particular who was an undergraduate mentor. His name is Greg Beabout. And he was just sort of sometimes when you're thinking about what you want to do with your life, it's encountering a person who models the thing that you think you might want to do. Yes. And for me, it was him. He was, a philosophy professor, had a lot of kids. And just, I looked at him, and I had met my, my future wife by that point. And that was, seemed to be a life that I was called to. And I like I said, I got into philosophy at first in part just sort of, because it was a means to maybe going on to the seminary. I was always interested, by that point in my life in theological questions, and then found out that I was really interested in philosophical questions too, as sort of undergirding and necessary to think seriously about theological issues. And then I went on for graduate study in philosophy, and have been doing it ever since.
And here you are today.
Yeah.
I have so many questions about philosophy that I want to get to, but I'd like to stop just on that point about the conversion experience. Mm-hmm. Some people have said that on this program. They've said it to me where it almost, if I could characterize it, it almost seems random, like some accident happened. Now, divine providence is never accidental. We know that. But, had you not gone to adoration, had you not gone to that retreat, there but for the grace of God, what might have happened? So I'm just interested to hear a little bit more about that retreat and that conversion experience. What happened to you in adoration? This is such a powerful thing that we both know. But what happened? Can you characterize what happened at that moment?
Yeah. So, one of the ways I'll say in which I hadn't been all that well catechized was just in making preparation for confession. So, I'd been to confession as a kid and, in high school, and even just in terms of, so one of the things that I was presented with at this retreat was like, I'll just say a detailed examination of conscience. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of confronted with the fact that I had not really examined my conscience very thoroughly. Mm-hmm. And then in adoration in this retreat, there was going to be an opportunity to go to confession. And I just sort of realized that the things that I didn't know about what, because I thought of myself as, a practicing Catholic, as serious, but I didn't really know and didn't take seriously enough the way in which that, has to form one's life and the way that one lives. And those are some of the things that I hadn't been taught, were just on like moral questions, and so it was just, in prayer, I, realized I was going to need to, go to confession and kind of think, seriously about how I was living. And as soon as, it's just grace.
Yes.
As soon as I, was thinking differently about my life in that way, it was immediate, the thought, maybe I should think about the priesthood. It was, just sort of starting to think about the retreat also posed that question at one point, if you're, to think about, to think about vocation. And in terms of the larger, sort of story of my life, it really was a pivotal, because I don't think I would have even applied to any Catholic colleges or universities. The high school that I was coming out of is a very serious prep school in Houston, and I had been looking at going to really competitive secular schools. I was interested mostly in math and physics. Rather, I didn't, if I had, gone a different direction, I would have, ended up as, an engineer or done something in the sciences. Yeah, so I mean that moment, that summer, changed my whole life.
It's a powerful testament, isn't it, to divine providence, and so I'm glad to hear that. I think people are interested to hear that. Maybe one other question before we move to the philosophical, the studies that you're currently practicing and so on. What do you think this has changed? I mean, I have children and grandchildren. I know you have children. You're a family man. You're a father and a husband. Is it changing for the next generation? Are we getting any better at catechesis in the school system? And that's not a loaded question. I'm just curious what you observe about that, because I know you're concerned about it.
Yeah. I don't know that I can speak to broader trends in the typical parochial school. I do have the sense that there are more better options available now. I mean, just comparing, Houston now to Houston when I was growing up. I think for those who want to find, a Catholic school that's serious about catechesis, and parishes that are serious about, catechesis, in CCE, it's, I think, an easier thing to find now. But then maybe it was easier to find back then than I would assume. But at the very least, it's easier for people who want to find, better catechetical instruction to find it. Part of it is just the ability through, I mean, we're on the internet right now, talking to each other, far away from each other. It's one of the advantages of, the current, current technological era, that those who are looking for, good things can actually have an easier time finding them, even if that technological era comes with a lot of other bad things.
Yes, it has the what I call the plus delta, the pluses and the deltas that we. So this is interesting, and I'm with you on. I believe that it's changing in the sense that there's a greater array there's offerings out there. There are products, you could say, let's call them products, that are out there for Catholics who wish to have their children, taught properly. And I think families, at least in the era that I grew up in, I'm a slight bit older than you are. I know that, Brian, but my family was very strong in the formation, and so when the 70s came along that I lived through, I might have strayed, or I might have become a little relativistic myself, but that background was always there in the distance, and it was pulling us back. And so I feel that. But today I look at my children and grandchildren, and I can see that there are many offerings out there and some great positive things. So that's good. That's a positive. Well, we said we'd go to philosophy, and so you are the head of you're the director of the Center for Thomistic Studies. And if you could tell us what that's all about, and I have so many questions about philosophy that we'll get to in a moment here, but what do you do? What is the director? What is the center? And how does it tie into the university?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, first, I'm, an associate professor of philosophy, here at University of St. Thomas. So I do, all the ordinary things that come with that. I, read and research and write about philosophy, mostly about the thought of Thomas Aquinas. I teach undergraduate courses, advise undergraduate students. I'm also the chair of the undergraduate department, so that's why this is a busy time of year for undergraduate advising. Now, the on the graduate side, the Center for Thomistic Studies is graduate philosophy program offering MA and PhD degrees, and it's the only graduate philosophy program in North America that's specially devoted to the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas and thought within the Thomistic tradition. And the thought of Thomas plays a very important role for the Catholic Church for Catholic theology,
Yes.
especially ever since Pope Leo XIII, Aeterni Patris, right, made this call for theology in the Church to return to Thomas, and to seek in the thought of St. Thomas a foundation and a guide for the work of theology and philosophy. And our own center is been around for about 42 years now. It's first officially founded in 1975, but we've been offering courses for about 42 years now. And we kind of have a historical, pedigree. We were sort of an offshoot of the Pontifical Institute for Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto, which was founded by Etienne Gilson. And the sort of line to the foundation of that is, fairly clear, right? From, it's a fruit from Leo XIII's Aeterni Patris and the Thomistic revival. So we have graduate students who study, it's like any other graduate philosophy program. And those who are, seeking just the master's degree might be interested in teaching at the high school level, or they might be doing the degree kind of just as an enrichment before going on to do something else with their careers.
Yes.
And then the students who go on for the PhD with us, that's with a view to, hopefully becoming a professor, either, in a seminary or in a college or university. We're a pretty small program. I mean, as a very specialized program, it's unusual for a graduate program in philosophy to be quite as specialized as we are. So to be so specially focused on the thought of Thomas and thought in engagement with the Thomistic tradition. But we have one of the best placement rates among graduate philosophy programs in the United States. We don't graduate tons and tons of PhD students, but when they do, they tend to go on and find full-time jobs in academia, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly in Catholic institutions.
So, this is very interesting. And I remember you telling me about this placement rate. So congratulations on that. That is an accomplishment, because, the average person thinking about philosophy would wonder what the jobs and the career prospects are. So you've outlined some of that. Could I ask you then, the revival of Thomistic studies, or the thought of St. Thomas, it's that, or what else? Could I ask you, what else is there besides that? And I know there are many answers to that, but what would you say?
Yeah, good. So it's true that there are some, rival answers, both in the context of, certainly outside of the context of, the Catholic, church and the Catholic, academic world, right?
Yes.
In terms of engagement with philosophy. Specifically within the world of Catholic academia, what are the alternatives? In the 20th century, a lot of thinkers pursued and followed, the new development and growth of the phenomenological tradition, going back especially to Edmund Husserl, and then other figures, especially Edith Stein, or Saint Teresa Benedicta, and John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, were contributors to emphasis on the phenomenological tradition. That's usually thought of as the sort of main alternative philosophical approach in terms of contemporary Catholic philosophy, and even Catholic colleges and universities that have maintained a serious Catholic identity in their philosophy departments. It's usually either there's some emphasis on medieval philosophy and especially on Thomism, or there's strong emphasis on the 20th century phenomenological tradition. So just in terms of what's out there now in Catholic colleges and universities, those are usually thought of as kind of the two alternative ways to go. The reasons for Aeterni Patris's revival of the Thomistic tradition, and the things to be said in favor of the importance of Thomistic philosophy and theology. I mean, what St. Thomas himself represents, going back to the 13th century. The 13th century is a time in which the Latin West, right, Latin Europe,
yes,
encountered for the first time the philosophical works of the Arabic world, and most of the philosophical works of Aristotle that had not previously been encountered. And it's a time when, in perhaps the most significant way since the early church, the question about the relationship between faith and reason, the question about the relationship between what we know by revelation and grace and what we can know by our own investigations into the natural world. The question about the relationship between those two is posed in the most explicit way. And what St. Thomas represents is a certain way of thinking about the relationship between faith and reason, in which human reason can, in fact, know a lot about our own nature, the nature of the world, the existence of God, the attributes of God, something of the purpose of human life. We actually have from God the ability to think about these questions in a serious way and discover serious answers to those questions in a way that doesn't contradict and doesn't, run into conflict with the things that we know in answer to those same sorts of questions from faith and revelation. And when Pope Leo XIII called for this revival of Thomistic philosophy, it was in recognition that, sort of looking back in the history of scholastic philosophy and theology, St. Thomas represented this unique, or at least sort of the most successful attempt to answer that fundamental question about the relationship between faith and reason, and to synthesize in a coherent way all of the wealth of the early philosophical tradition that had come into the Western European world from the Greeks and the Arabs, along with the theological wisdom and the wisdom from the fathers and councils, and to answer all the objections that anyone could could pose at the time that would assert any kind of conflict or inconsistency between the best and highest achievements of human reason and the things that we know by the faith. Now, it's not to say that St. Thomas answered every question that could be posed, but he provided a model for what the integration of faith and reason looks like. And when Leo XIII is calling for the Thomistic revival at the end of the 19th century, it's with a recognition that Catholic schools over the past 150 to 200 years had tried to articulate a new synthesis between Catholic faith and revelation and theology on the one hand, and what had become the dominant philosophical views, in the universities and schools in the intervening period, which owed more to early modern and high modern philosophy, so especially Descartes and Kant. There had been attempts to sort of build up a synthesis, and it was in part from a judgment that those syntheses weren't going in the right direction, and that one couldn't really find in figures like Descartes and Kant an adequate foundation for the reconciliation and integration of faith and reason, or for a robust Catholic theology. That Pope Leo XIII made this call that the church needed to go to Thomas, return to Thomas. And much of the history of 20th century and now 21st century Catholic philosophy and theology was changed by that really pivotal moment.
You've mentioned a few times, Brian, the juxtaposition or the confluence of faith and reason, and I have to say that one of the most favorite encyclicals I've ever read, probably 10 years ago, I think at least, Fides et Ratio, Pope John Paul II's Faith and Reason, that struck me as a powerful synthesis of how faith and reason can accompany. And faith is not something that's blind without logic. We're going to get to philosophy in a second here, but I love that faith and reason. So what you're saying is that combination continues in the Catholic faith to be a pivotal point, an operative point.
Yes, absolutely. And we could start to talk about philosophy itself a little bit.
Sure, let's go there, because one of my questions and I'm sure our audience will be interested. what's the point of studying philosophy? Now, I'm not being silly when I ask that, because it's the foundational science in many ways, isn't it? But can you lead us through why should we study philosophy, and why? I'll have a sub question. Why does our modern kind of relativistic crazy world that we're in now, why does it need philosophy, and it's missing it seems to me? Yeah, that's a place to start, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think the first thing to say is, we do have to distinguish between, just philosophy itself and what, academic philosophers do, or what philosophy is as an academic subject or profession. Mm-hmm. Philosophy itself affects everything that we do, because all of the fundamental questions in terms of which we live our lives, in terms of which we think about what we are and what we're supposed to do and what we should choose to do, they're all ultimately philosophical questions. And this is the reason I wanted to turn to talking about philosophy, is because you mentioned fides et ratio. And one of the insights early in fides et ratio is that there are these just perennial, fundamental, existential human questions, right? Mm-hmm. About what we are, what human nature is, what the purpose of human life is, what the structure of reality is, whether there's life after death, whether God exists, right? What happiness is, and so on and so on. These are all questions that every human being, in fact, cares very deeply about. And all of us live our lives at least presupposing certain answers to those questions. Yes. Now, you can live your life without ever really thinking carefully about, these questions. You can live an unexamined life in which you don't take the time that's needed to think carefully about the issues involved with these questions. So, why should academic philosophy exist? Why should there be people who study and teach philosophy? Well, because like any other subject, one needs, teachers, and one needs guides in learning how to think through, the basic, questions in a given field. In this case, the questions, really that matter as philosophical questions are these most fundamental, deep human questions. And we need help. They're not easy questions, to answer on one's own. And that's why we depend upon, the philosophical tradition, and depend upon teachers to get started thinking about the answers to these questions. As far as the relationship between faith and reason, something that I find helpful to, when, Catholics are trying to think through, like, what exactly is the role of philosophy in a philosophical questioning. One of the other, things that's very nice about fides et ratio is that it makes very clear that the Catholic faith, what the Catholic faith offers, is in fact a set of answers to those philosophical questions, right? Yes. The Catholic faith is philosophical in that sense, right? Yes. We draw the distinction, as Catholics, between philosophy and theology, right? Philosophy is what we can kind of do on our own by human reason, and theology is what we do with dependence upon grace and revelation and faith. Yes. But what the faith offers is, in fact, a set of coherent answers to those deep, fundamental human questions. Mm-hmm. But even to think through those questions in theology, you still need you need the notions and the concepts and the terminology that that one has to articulate in philosophical terms. Even theology is still a human pursuit and has to involve, human language, human concepts. Yeah. And so theology is deeply dependent upon the work of philosophy, even if philosophy by itself isn't totally adequate or sufficient. Even if at the end of the day, philosophy alone can't give fully satisfactory answers to all of those deep human questions.
So let's try this now on at the level of, let's say, a college student looking for their future life, deciding what to do. Even somebody who's at work today, let's say the father, the mother in a family, they're raising children, they're living through life. They may have a job, they may be in an office, in a factory, in a software thing. There's all kinds of possibilities. Take what you've just said, Brian, and bring it then to that theoretical. I guess I've created an avatar there, a sort of a picture of somebody. How does philosophy and the use thereof improve their life, and what should they do about it? Is where I'm going with this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this is another, just to come back to, something we said before. I mean, we do live in, I think, in one way, in a privileged time in terms of
Yes.
the resources that are available and the things that you can find if you look for them. I used to teach at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., and that's the home sponsor for the Thomistic Institute in the United States. And there are lots and lots of resources available for people who are interested. If you have any interest in, sort of getting started and thinking about philosophy, or thinking about what it is that philosophy can offer, right, to, an individual Catholic, and, regardless of what period in life you are, or what your profession is, or so I would, there's a series of YouTube videos called Aquinas 101 that the Thomistic Institute puts out.
If you send me that all that information, we will put it in the show notes. So we'll add all those.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
If you would like to do that at the end, and in the end, I'll ask you for other things that perhaps you're publishing and that you're working on. But we'll definitely load up the show notes with all of these useful tools.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. So and in terms of what does this offer? To the sort of the avatar that you depicted. Well, I mean, all of us have these very deep questions. I mean, everyone differs a little bit in terms of how they understand their own faith and their commitments to the the teachings of the church. But we all confront objections. We may have doubts about points of church teaching that are really matters of it's things that are really philosophical objections, to which there might be very good answers, right? That that have been proposed by others, and because at the end of the day, our commitment to the faith is not, it's not simply determined by, it's not the fruit of just our own intellectual activity,
right?
It's not something like you can't think your way into the gift of faith.
You can go
but on the other hand, it has to be intellectually satisfying to you. And this is something, even thinking about raising kids and how to hand on the faith to the kids. I mean, one of the things, and I probably, put more emphasis on this because I'm a philosophy professor, but it's just thinking of my own experience growing up. I mean, presentation of the faith and the way that we think through the sorts of questions associated with the faith, it needs to be intellectually serious. It needs to really answer the questions that are at issue and be able to stand up against, objections. And I mean, that's one of the things that the wonderful model of St. Thomas is, now this is just a feature of 13th century theology generally. When you write, you're constantly posing all the best objections to your position, right? Yes. And then responding to them. That's right. And so I'd say that's the thing that it offers is, not the only line of defense, but one of the important sort of lines of defense against, for those who experience, doubt or confusion about what the content of the faith is.
I'm reminded of a difference here, and I believe I'm not creating a straw man argument here, but it's, the Baltimore Catechism provides the answers, and I love it in all of its varieties, all of its variations, and it was very useful in the formation of my own family. And yet that's the answers. But what we need is to be able to defend by not just providing the answers, beautiful and as rich and as true as they are. We need something else. We need a philosophical base. And I think at least that's where my mind just went when you said that. We love to have the answers. We need them. Baltimore, we need, but we also need some sort of a tool that we can use ourselves in our own life to apply our life or the principles that we're talking about to our life, and therefore then, increase in virtue and in the faith.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And this is one of the places where a distinction that St. Thomas draws is helpful, a really important distinction for thinking about the relationship between philosophy and theology, between faith and reason. He draws a distinction between things that are that he calls preambles to faith, and the things that we can call mysteries of faith. And so Catholic, doctrine teaches this whole set of truths, concerning what a good human life, looks like, what we can and can't do in moral terms, that we, will survive our deaths in some way, at least our souls, will survive death, that God exists, and so on. And this distinction is between those things that belong to and are taught by the church that can only be known because God reveals them, right? And those are the mysteries of the faith.
Yes.
And then there are all of these other truths that are taught by the church, and we profess them in the creed, but the church teaches that these are things that actually can be known by human philosophical reasoning. So that the most common examples are the existence and unity of God,
yes,
and the immortality of the soul,
yes,
and then a whole bunch of moral truths. The church's own teaching is basically that the content of the 10 Commandments. It's not the case that human beings can only know those moral truths, right, by virtue of divine teaching. We're capable of knowing it, ultimately by divine teaching, but through the light of reason that God has given us.
Which then, so you're hitting the fundamental point, I think, here, which is that if we equip the next generation, or any of us, any generation, with the philosophical foundation, the way to think, perhaps, will we be able to defend ourselves against error? Will we be able to defend ourselves against, any crazy old thing that is thrown at us in a relativistic way?
I think the short answer to that is yes. Or at least it's, it's a thing that is, if not absolutely indispensable. At least in terms of what our own human efforts are capable of, capable of accomplishing, or, how they're able to be used by God and his providence. It seems indispensable to me that, and even thinking sort of the history of, Western philosophy and sort of history of Catholic theology, again, the reason why, Pope Leo XIII called for this revival of, the Thomistic tradition is because of a perception that the direction that Catholic schools were going in terms of their philosophy was no longer able to provide just that defense, right? And, people's understanding of the faith itself was being sort of altered and skewed because of philosophical presuppositions that they were bringing to bear and thinking through, thinking about the content of the faith. I won't say that it's it's not a panacea for us, but at least in my own life, I can say I don't think I would be Catholic if I hadn't found, serious and, coherent and rigorous answers, to the sorts of questions that we're talking about.
I'd like to talk about critical thinking for a moment. I had a classical Jesuit education and a Jesuit boys' school, Campion College, and it's a great education. And I remember very much listening to the explanation of what we were about to enter at that time in the grade 9 in a Canadian province, and we're going to teach you how to think critically. And so much is said about that. Could you comment? What does that mean? And what, are we, because right now I can see we're not teaching people how to think critically. People are accepting of anything that is thrown at them. And so what is this about critical thinking? Can you give us something on that one, Brian, please?
Yeah. And there's some common background for us there, because I also, the prep school I mentioned earlier is a Jesuit high school. Here in Houston. And I remember the expression critical thinking being something that I encountered right away as a freshman, and we were told we were going to be taught critical thinking. I do remember a book that was used in a freshman course, a book for sort of reasoning and argumentation that was used. Now, my impression, I'm actually not always, I'm not that keen on the expression critical thinking as a name for the thing that we need to teach young people. Because at least in terms of what it often ended up connoting, even if it wasn't what it denoted when I was in high school, is that what you were taught was sort of the habit of calling into question and doubting, anything that was put forward by authority, right?
That's a poor tool to give somebody, isn't it? Really, it's not helpful.
Exactly. Yeah, that like you're engaging in critical thinking. No, I mean, look, that is an intellectual skill, right? The
Sure,
ability to think up what the best objections are, right?
sure.
And the ability to see what the problems are with a given position. And we do have to subject, right,
Yes.
Catholic
Sure.
theology to
That's right.
that. I
It has to
mean,
be robust and defensible in all those ways. But I think I know where you mean it. It's a term, and of course it's not that the term critical thinking has changed, but there's critical this theory, critical that theory, critical historical biblical. There's all these different ways which connote this negative sort of questioning thing. But I think we're talking about something very different here.
yeah, that's right. That's right. So, I mean, the thing that does need to be taught, and the thing that I was grateful to have had a first introduction, to even in high school was just, very basics of, logic, right, reasoning, argumentation. And it's something that we encounter with, college students now, that a lot of students come into college not really able to recognize, within a paragraph of text that there's an argument, and that, to know what premises are, and know what a conclusion is, be able to figure out what the point, of even a short paragraph is. It does seem like it's something that's not being taught effectively to a lot of young people. And in terms of the way that people are formed now, especially I think by social media, is just that I mean, there are in fact arguments being made, but nobody is taught how to think in terms of,
Yes.
what the arguments are. In fact, what people encounter, it's assertions and counter assertions,
Yes.
signals about, sort of what group or camp you're with,
Yep,
right?
that's right.
As opposed to who you're against.
Yep.
And then lots of, emotional appeal. I mean, so those are emotional appeals to pathos. They're arguments, right? But people aren't taught to recognize them as such. Here at the university with the undergraduates, I teach one of the logic courses. We call it the traditional or Aristotelian logic course, and the students who take this course tend to be very grateful that they've taken it, and to wonder why they weren't introduced to a lot of the notions in this course, 10 years ago, much sooner in their lives. Yeah.
I can tell you that I took logic in grade 9 at the Jesuit school, and just a couple of weeks ago I was at a dinner, and I was speaking with someone who's an executive with a large Canadian oil and gas company, big company, and a vice president level person, and we were talking about syllogisms, and that person had no idea what I was talking about. And I have to be careful here because I'm going to be way out of my league in a moment here. But, I was talking about what a major premise is and a minor premise, and how you come to a conclusion, and how you can tell simply by listening to someone's argument and categorizing it that way. You can tell whether it's a false or a true argument. Yeah. And the discussion, the people around us were sort of like, wow, that's pretty profound, Henry. And I going, wow, yeah, but
that's right. Yeah, even that there are such things as, logical forms, syllogistic forms, and that some of them are valid and some of them are invalid, and that you can actually think through this. I mean, I one student I met for advising just today, and I remember last year when he was in that class, and it was very basic stuff from the syllogistic, and I remember when he realized that he could prove that this one syllogistic form was valid, he was just like, he's now a philosophy major. But it was like this eye-opening sort of eureka moment for him. Yes. And, this is something that would have been taught to 10-year-olds, 500 years ago. Yeah. Yeah. And, no, there's a lot that that's been lost in the shift away from. I mean, I'm a big proponent, very happy about the move towards classical education and younger education. Yes. It's becoming more common for those in the classical education movement for kids to encounter logic while they're in grade school, which is once upon a time that's when you would have first done it. You wouldn't have been waiting until high school or certainly college. Before being, being exposed to this for the first time. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it makes me wonder,
what a philosophy professor does at home with his children. Now, I don't know if your family homeschools or not, but what does the philosophy professor teach to his children at home?
Yeah, good. So we did homeschool for quite a while. Our oldest is about to become a teenager, and we homeschooled him and all the others up until a couple of years ago. Now we still homeschool the oldest, and our others are in the local parish grade school, which has been wonderful. It's a classical curriculum, parochial school. Yeah, there's always been, I mean, in addition to whatever curricula we were using with our oldest, there've always been little lessons in logic, and little lessons in philosophy. I had a conversation with him once when he was 6 about eternity. We were going through actually Baltimore Catechism, St. Joseph Catechism, with him, and it had the claim in it that God knows everything, and God knows everything that ever has happened, ever will happen. And he was only 6, but he had a question. He basically just asked, like, how could God know what I'm going to do tomorrow? How could he know that?
Yeah.
And I ended up running him through very like a 6-year-old version of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy on the notion of eternity. But as one of, and he still remembers it. He has kind of a devotion to Boethius because of this this conversation back then.
That's great. No,
so I try not to lay too much on
no, I get it. It's like the car mechanic, does the child of the car mechanic know how to fix a car? And I think what you're saying is that they can at least open the hood and take a look inside in the Dr. Brian Carl household,
right.
That's great.
Yeah,
well, let's take a look then at the world around us. Could you guide us through a little bit of the world is a crazy place. There's much good and much wonder in the world, wonderment and goodness, but there's also some troubling things. What do you see that I'm not sure. There's so many things I could ask you. Where are we heading? Can you tell us where we're heading and what the remedy for that is? And I'm sure that is a loaded question.
Yeah,
that is probably an unfair question, but I'm interested in what a philosopher sees ahead and possible remedies for it.
Yeah. Well, I will say philosophers differ a fair bit in temperament in terms of willingness to try to prognosticate, and because I mostly do metaphysics and philosophical theology, I tend to be very careful about the things that I can say I really know for sure, as opposed to the areas where I realize my opinion is probably not any better than anyone else's, and maybe even not as good. So insofar as that sort of like big picture where we're going question involves reflecting on a lot of things in politics and contemporary culture. I'm actually probably not the best person to try to answer. So I'll give you the philosophical theologian's answer. Of course, we're going where providence is ultimately where providence is leading us.
Yeah, it's good.
And in terms of immediate, things that I see that worry me or encourage me, and just thinking. I mean, I'm still a pretty young father, but our kids are young still.
Yes.
I, as a lot of other people, I worry a ton about the influence of social media on this younger generation.
Yes.
About what exposure to, the kids who have cell phones from like a young age and are exposed to social media, and what that's doing in terms of attentional capacity. And going back to the sort of deep human questions, and even just the idea of culture. A wonderful book that everyone should read is Josef Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And the very notion, culture, right, is grounded in cultus, right? The things, if culture is all of those social and artistic and literary goods that are beyond the things that we strictly need, right? They're the things that we have that are sort of the riches for a society. All genuine culture is ultimately grounded in what we worship, in what we, in what we regard as the highest and the best.
Yes.
And, the current, climate, especially, for the kids who, have, cell phones or, are tied to electronics all the time. I mean, even the capacity to pay attention long enough to think seriously about a serious question seems to be really damaged, right, for the younger generation now. And this is something we're starting to see, with a lot of undergraduate students. There are undergraduate students who it's very difficult for them to read a whole chapter of a book at once because they've had, cell phones, buzzing at them and drawing their attention since they were, since they were teenagers.
Yeah.
And the reason I brought up, Pieper's Leisure, the basis of culture, is this idea that what we need in order to develop and sustain and grow culture is ultimately grounded in the things that we worship and the things that we regard as the best and as sort of the ultimate purpose for human life. But you need leisure, you need time, you need attention. And we seem to be living in a period where, I mean, the biggest cause of worry for me, is in terms of, what's going on in contemporary society is tied up with just the destruction of people's attention and ability to engage in sustained thinking about anything, let alone about, these deep human questions.
Right.
The reason people don't engage in enough reflection about how they ought to live is usually for some reason or another, they don't want to take the time. Right. It may be that they worry that if they think seriously about these questions, it's going to be inconsistent with the way that they like living. Yeah. Right. But in part, it's exactly. But in part, it's just being willing to take the time to do it. And, what I'm seeing and worry about with a lot of, the younger generation now is they've been so impacted by the sort of world of electronics and social media that they couldn't give the time to thinking seriously and slowly and carefully about these sorts of questions, even if they want to. And so and that's something that we're, with undergraduate students, teaching them how to, think carefully and slowly about one thing is not something you'd have thought that you needed to try to figure out how to encourage students to do that, even 15 years ago.
It's interesting. It's a very, and I'm glad we went to, this is a difficult area because parents, and as grandparents, we're all concerned about this attention span thing. Yeah. We're also concerned about the inability to kind of come up with I was going to say a philosophy of life, that's the notion, but we're challenged because even a couple of weeks ago, I heard a good sermon from a priest about mental prayer. Well, what's the one premise about mental prayer? You have to sit down quietly in and recollect yourself. Well, what does that mean? It means, I guess, shutting off everything else, doesn't it? Yeah. And recollecting. So mental prayer is also premised on this. So what do you think about that? Mental prayer as a tool, is that part of the answer here?
I think it is. I mean, I think for practicing Catholics, the thing that is one of the main things that can be proposed as like a good that you just can't have unless you are willing to, to set aside, right, and sort of distance yourself from these sorts of, distractions. I mean, I say all this about smartphones. I have a smartphone. I try to live with, to live with it. I know a lot of academics who, and even in the last couple of years, who've made the decision to get rid of the smartphone and, and try to live with, with some version of a dumb phone, just because that's the way to, sort of reassert control, right, over, freedom from this particular source of distraction. I think you're right. I mean, it's always easier to resist something that's evil if you have some good in view. Yeah. And, if you can propose the good of mental prayer is, if and I think for a lot of us, at least people my age, if you can look back to a time when you actually remember the ways in which it was better when you weren't distracted, right? And the things that you used to be able to do, right? When you
Well,
weren't distracted all the time. The trouble for the young generation is not even having those, not even having that memory, right? Never having built the habit.
I feel like I really feel like the grandparent when I tell my kids that I remember when there were no computers. I remember when we would fly from, on business. I would fly from, let's say, Calgary to Phoenix, and we'd stop in Salt Lake City to change planes. Everybody would run off the plane, run to the bank of of public pay phones, pull out your pay card, and phone the office. Any messages? Any messages for me at the office? And now it's a hilarious story. But yes, this is an important area that I know you're concerned about. I'm glad we talked about this. How about we've got some time here, a few minutes yet, and I'd like to hear more about what the center is doing, what the university is doing, where you want to take these things, what's going on, what are the publications, if you could tell us about the work that you're all doing there for the good of mankind and for students.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the undergraduate side, University of St. Thomas has been going through a period recently of strengthening and renewing Catholic identity and mission.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's a university with a history as a small liberal arts Catholic college. There was a really just, fantastic, wonderful, small, faithful liberal arts, Catholic college. It's gone through a period of expansion into, other programs, has become more of a comprehensive university with,
yes.
programs in, business and the sciences and nursing and so on. And we've been going through for a number of years now a period of sort of strengthening Catholic mission and identity for this larger university that we've become. It's the only Catholic university in the Houston area, and which is obviously a huge, metropolitan area with a lot of Catholics.
Yes.
And one thing that we've done recently is renew and update our core curriculum, which we're very excited about. We're, I think, the only Catholic university in recent decades to have undertaken a serious revision of Catholic core curriculum, to have cut the overall size of the core curriculum, which is there's just immense pressure for the contemporary academy to do this because of the size of some of the majors, especially in the sciences and and so on. But to have done that without cutting philosophy or theology or literature.
Yes.
And in fact, what we one of the things that's most exciting is we have a course up front that has a fair bit of logic in it. Logic had even for us had been one of the casualties. Once upon a time, 40 years ago, at any Catholic college, pretty much every student at a Catholic college would get roughly the equivalent of a minor in philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
And every student would study logic and natural philosophy and human nature and ethics and so on. Even we were one of the places where logic was, chopped rather than something else. So we weren't teaching logic to, all of our freshmen for a long time. So that's kind of been restored at the front of the program. So anyway, there's a very exciting core curriculum renewal that's happened here and is a part of these larger efforts to make UST a much a serious sort of strengthen its identity as a serious place for Catholic undergraduate education.
Yeah.
And then on the graduate side for the center, as I said, the center's been around for about 42 years now, and we're going through a period in which I think there's more interest than ever from prospective students for studying in our programs. We have some of the best faculty that we've ever had. One person I would highlight in particular, you'd mentioned, you'd asked before about resources and things that people might read, and I would highlight one of my colleagues in particular, Stephen Jensen, who's authored a bunch of books in Thomistic philosophy, but including a few that are pretty widely accessible. And just very helpful, sort of foundational for philosophical account of human nature and Thomistic ethics. So his work I would want to highlight.
Excellent.
And then, I've mentioned this to you before. We're trying to get serious about fundraising efforts for
Yes.
the Center for Thomistic Studies. I'm still pretty junior, as I said, as a director and a leader, and this is one of the things that I'm learning how to do, even if a little bit slowly. So if I can make one final plug, if we can put up a link for donations to the
Absolutely.
Center for Thomistic Studies.
We will do that, because without the center and without the study of philosophy, I think we are at a great loss in society. And so definitely we'd like to help as much as possible. So for sure we'll add that to our show notes.
Yeah.
And another area that I'm very interested in, as we're coming to the natural close of our time together today, but what are you doing yourself, Dr. Brian Carl? What are you publishing? What are you studying? What's your main focus? And what are your sort of plans for the next few years in your own academic development?
Yeah. So a lot of the work that I do is sort of an outgrowth and continuation of work that I did in my dissertation. So I wrote on Thomas's philosophical theology on the divine attributes. So a lot of my publications have to do with matters connected to the divine attributes. But I've also, in the last couple of years, published a couple of things on evolution and sort of how to reconcile Thomistic metaphysics with evolution, or at least the question of whether they can be reconciled, and arguing that they can be. And then I'm interested in various questions in sort of philosophical psychology and epistemology. Now, my own, I didn't anticipate that I would be, director of a graduate program quite at this point yet in my career. And so there's a longer list of things that I want to work on in terms of my own publication and scholarship. And I hope, in the time that I'm the director for this graduate program, especially on the fundraising side, that we can get to the point where I will once again have more leisure.
Oh, that's great. No, that's
more time to write.
That's a wonderful thing. Could you give us a minute on the divine attributes? I'm very fascinated by that idea, and I think people would love to hear if you have a couple of moments of thought on that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the way into thinking about St. Thomas's thought on the divine attributes. So the divine attributes are just the characteristics that belong to God. That God is good, that God is powerful, that God is wise, and so on. And when I was an undergraduate and was first learning some Thomistic philosophy, I encountered this, kind of astounding and difficult to understand at first idea that, very famously for Thomas Aquinas, God is subsistent existence itself, right? Ipsum esse subsistens, that God is being itself. Right? And was always fascinated, and it was a question that kind of raised even for my prayer life. I was told that one of the sort of fruits of philosophical thinking about God should be contemplation, and the way that you sort of think about God and praise God even in prayer. And so that was actually what originally prompted me to want to work on questions about the divine attributes. And one of the sort of things that I was interested in was, the extent to which this philosophical claim that God is, in fact, being itself or existence itself, is that the single most important insight that we can have about the divine in this life? Should that be sort of the centerpiece of the way that we think theologically about God? It's a very profound and important statement. But should it be sort of the first, and what you think of as sort of the first and most important thing to know about God, in such a way that you would sort of, even in prayer, praise God, right, as as being itself in front of other things. And so I wrote a dissertation on the order of the divine attributes in Thomas's philosophical theology, and the relation between the different attributes. And at least for that question that I just posed, I mean, ultimately came to the conclusion that for Thomas, what's most important about the divine attributes, so again, things like, God's being, goodness, power, wisdom, and so on. What's most important for him is that in this life, the best and the most that we can do in coming to try to think about God, because God is infinitely beyond what we're able to understand in this life, or what we're able to grasp by our knowledge of created realities. All of those things that we attribute to God as perfections, like goodness and power and wisdom and so on, they're all complementary, imperfect likenesses that are sort of like, to use a not great metaphor, is sort of partial windows, right? Through which, we see, well, and to borrow the scriptural metaphor, right? Through which we see as in a glass darkly, right?
Yes, yeah.
And in fact, in this life, the thing that Thomas actually emphasizes the most is that we need a multiplicity of many different notions to try and, get at understanding God. We can't know what he is in himself in this life. And so he consistently distinguishes the multiplicity of notions through which we know God in this life. And that's always contrasted with the unity of the vision of God in the life to come. So in the beatific vision, he likes to quote this text from the book of Zechariah. In that day, the Lord will be one and his name will be one. And the moment in which, there's knowledge of God that really is just unified, and it's just you knowing God, is only in the beatific vision. Yeah. And in this life, we have to know him through many names and many notions, precisely because we don't have the beatific vision yet.
This is it's a wonderful development. I'm glad I asked you that, because that's we live in hope and the belief that when we have the beatific vision, if we are given that gift and we are there, then we will ponder for all eternity this unity of God. It's a beautiful and it's a laudable objective for us to all reach for. So that's great. Well, Brian, it's we could talk a lot longer, and I hope that I could have you back one of these days to talk more about all these things. I have a feeling that in my gradual journey towards Texas, I may sit at the footsteps of Dr. Brian Carl, at the feet of Dr. Brian Carl sometime in another colloquium, or perhaps in the logic class or something like that. So, but thank you for being with us today. It's been wonderful to speak with you. It's great work you're doing. May God bless you, the work, the school, the faculty, your family, and I hope we can talk to you again soon.
Okay. No, thank you so much for having me, and God bless you and all of your efforts as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, everyone, thanks for being with us today. It's the Catholic CEO, Henry Katarna. My guest, Dr. Brian Carl. Very interesting, and I hope to see you again next time. Thank you very much.